Okay, so unfortunately, when we do these GC talks, we have to do the obligatory, here's how the GC thing is laid out, so bear with me with that. At the beginning, hopefully, we have a case study at the end, which I think is probably for some of you would be the more interesting part of the talk. For those of you that don't have enough of an idea of the structure of what's going on in Java Heap, then the beginning will be, you should be happy with that. Okay, so a little bit about this talk here, right? Do your GC logs speak to you? The name really comes from an incident that I had many years ago when I was working in Luxembourg, actually, at a bank, and we just got a brand new performance monitoring tool in, and it was really cool because it had all these like squiggly lines going across the screen, just like all good performance monitoring tools are supposed to have. And I was looking at this thing going, wow, this is really cool. And I had this architect behind me who was looking at it and says, he's French, so I think I got some slavish translation from some French expression, right? So it's like, is that speaking to you? And I said, wow, that's a really interesting expression. And I looked at him and I said, and it's also a really wonderful opportunity. And I said, yes, why, of course. And I expected the next thing he was going to say is, well, what is it saying? At that point, I would have said, well, I don't really have a clue, but But anyways, and I guess that's pretty much how we look at garbage collection logs, right? We just look at this massive blob of numbers, and then we just say, okay, I'll just give the heap 10 gigs because that sounds good, and let's work out the rest later on and see what's going on, because when I look at this stuff, it's like, yuck. Okay. Anyway, so hopefully we can clear some of that up today. So a little bit about me. So I have a consultancy where I do training and tuning, and have worked, with performance tuning since about 1998, quite accidentally. There's other stuff, but I think we can just use Google if you want. This is where we're very close to where a friend of mine, Heinz, lives. He's over there in the corner. And we offer a couple of times a year, we offer our performance tuning course at his house, somewhere close to over there. So you can imagine there's a little bit of beach time in there and stuff like that, but it's kind of fun. And most recently, I started this tooling company called Clarity. So all of our tools and stuff are actually are being developed there and being released through that particular entity. So standard disclaimer at the front, any resemblance of any opinion, recommendation, or anything offered during this presentation that resembles performance tuning advice is merely coincidental. In other words, advice given at a conference is not a substitute for common sense, so everything we say, go home and kick the wheels on it before you take it as being golden, right? Okay, why should I monitor GC? Well, easy, right? GC logs contain critical information. It's the information you need to know how to tune the heap spaces in your system. Without this, you're essentially just guessing, and you're probably giving up on a lot of performance in your system. I spend a lot of time reading GC logs, and I spend a lot of time helping customers try to tune their GC. It's generally a multi-step process that can take a long time. It doesn't take that much effort, but it can take a long time because it just takes a long time to collect the data that you need in order to do a good analysis, right? What is the performance impact of logging GC in production? Well, in my experience, no one has ever felt the performance impact of logging GC in production unless their GC logs have filled a disk or something like that, right? And if your GC logs are filling a disk, that means you either have incredibly small disks or far too frequent GCs. How do I get a GC log? Well, here's a whole bunch of flags, and there's dozens more that you can use, and the more you use, the more information you get, but the more complicated the logs get. So I tend to stick to just a couple, like the print GC details and printing the Tenuring Distribution, right, and make sure that the data goes to a log file instead of being written to std out, which is what the verbose GC does. All of the other things can give me interesting information under different conditions, but those are the ones that I'm going to stick with primarily. Okay, so what do you get? Okay, for those of you who have faint at heart, close your eyes now. There we go, right? Okay, it's not quite that ugly. So if we're going to understand what this thing is saying, and this is where some of you might want to bear with me for a second, we actually have to understand what it is we're trying to describe here, right? So the first thing we want to look at is say, okay, you know, what happens? So we start up a Java virtual machine, and then we're basically going to reserve a chunk of C heap, and we're going to call that Java heap, and then we're just going to lay out the data structure, right into this big chunk of memory. So we can set the size of this by using this particular flag here, minus mx on size, and that gives us our maximum heap size. Then what we're going to do is we're going to create a generational space. This is similar to what you saw being discussed this morning and during the advanced JVM tuning sessions. We're going to make it generational, which means that we're going to subdivide this into a young and old space. Now, there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can use this, we can divide this by using a ratio, or we can divide this by just saying what the young size is going to be, and the leftover is going to go to old. I prefer ratios because then I can take advantage of adaptive sizing. And what adaptive sizing says is going to let's use some heuristics here to try to decide what's the best internal sizes of these spaces in order to minimize the impact of garbage collection on our application's throughput. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to further divide the young generational space into these three spaces called Eden, Survivor 0, and Survivor 1. Now you might notice on the slides I have N and a 1 and a 1 right there. That's really gets to, how do I size that? Well, I'm going to set this thing called Survivor Ratio, and the Survivor Ratio is going to take all of the space in young generational, what I've allocated for young generational space, and it's going to say, okay, whatever the current size is right now, and that's determined by adaptive sizing, I'm going to apply, then I'm going to divide that into n plus 2 spaces. Eden gets n of them, and each of the survivor spaces gets 1. Okay? And really what we're going to see is that Eden is going to be consumed by our application threads, or garbage collection, people call them Mutator Threads. So like you are the aliens coming into our space here. And eventually, we're going to fill that space. And when we fill that space, we're going to get an allocation failure. And then these things called garbage collection threads are going to run, and they're going to do something, right? Now, this is a shared data structure. It's multi-threaded. That means we have concurrency concerns. How do we manage that? Well, we're going to go into this activity called safe pointing. What safe pointing is we're going to take our our Java code, and we're going to sprinkle it with these things called safe points. And when the garbage collection is going to be triggered, the first thing it's going to do is touch a safe point that says, Mutator Threads, when you actually touch a safe point, you have to stop. And then when all of the Mutator Threads are stopped, then the garbage collection can proceed, right? And that gives us our full stop the world pause that we've all come to expect, love, and embrace, right? Right, and so, if we need to get information about safe pointing, then of course there's another flag we can set, and that gives us even more information about what's going on in this particular case. So the garbage collector is going to run, and it's going to recover all dereferenced memory. It's going to do this 2 ways. Either we're going to have a scavenge, or we're going to have a full GC, or, well, okay, so that's really the 2 types, right? So the scavenge means I'm only going to collect one pool. I'm either going to collect young or tenured. And so we have a par new collector, which will collect young generational space, and we have a concurrent mark sweep collector, which will scavenge through tenured space, right? The full GC is going to collect all memory pools, both young and tenured space. So that's really the difference between the 2. To do that, we're going to use this thing called mark and sweep. The mark and sweep starts with, well, we're going to save point, and then we have mutual exclusive access to everything. We're going to do a scan for roots, which means I have to go through, right? For example, let's say Eden. We're going to collect Eden. Well, then I have to go through survivor spaces, and I have to go through tenured, and I have to go through, my thread stacks, and I have to find all of the things in those spaces that are references pointing into Eden, right? That becomes part of my GC root set. And from the GC root set, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start and trace, and I'm going to find all live objects. Thank you. It's probably annoying the hell out of everybody. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to trace all live objects. And in the case of Eden, what I'm going to do is I'm going to evacuate all of those live objects into the inactive survivor space. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to do the same thing for the survivor space. And I'm going to move all of the live objects from the active survivor space into the inactive survivor space, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that inactive survivor space active. So you can sort of see something here, right? Mutator threads are mostly allocating objects, well, they're allocating objects in Eden most of the time, right, with a few edge cases. And all of the other spaces, right, the allocation happens via the garbage collection threads. Right? So we say the sweep, in this case, from the mark and sweep, we're going to evacuate all the objects out, right? Well, we say, well, sort of. There's some certain things that can happen here. Eden is obviously larger than survivor spaces, so if we have too many objects surviving the attempt to collect, God, I sound like a mass murderer with that slip up, right? Freudian. If they survive the attempt to collect, then what happens is that we get this condition called where we're going to actually, if we move everything into the survivor space, we're going to flood that memory pool. Obviously, we can't do that. So we have to do something to clear that out, which means that might be a direct promotion directly into tenured, or we might roll back the tenuring threshold. So Hotspot will come along and say, well, I know you said the tenuring threshold should be 4, but I think it should be 2 in order to make room. So we're going to get rid of anything that's older than age 2 and put it directly up into tenured space. And that's a premature promotion event, right? So when I speak of tenuring, what I'm talking about is the age of an object. And the age of an object is determined by the number of collections it survives. Okay? So with that, you probably think that, okay, frequency of collection is probably important, because if garbage collections happen more frequently, well, you sort of have these orthogonal events. You have the garbage collector running, right? And then you have your application determining the lifetime of an object. And these sort of things, they run sort of orthogonally to each other, right? If the garbage collector runs faster, more objects survive because your application isn't finished with them, right? So you say you have an object and it takes you a second to process it, right? If the garbage collector is running at 5 times a second, that means it's going to get to age 5 before it actually gets collected. If you're running at once every 2 seconds, then, it's going to be collected after you're finished with it. So you can see that the frequency of collection here actually has some bearing on how objects actually travel through these spaces. What we want to do is we want to work hard, in this case, to make sure that we collect everything in the young generational space, because when we get the collection in the young generational space, that's the cheap one. By the time we get to tenured, as I mentioned earlier, for the people that attended the other talks, right, there's a lot more work that has to be done, because that's an in-place collection. We cannot compact with a concurrent mark sweep collector. We have to have a full parallel GC in order to do a compaction, right? And we have to maintain free lists, and there's a whole bunch of extra work that we don't have to do when we can evacuate. Because when we can evacuate, what we end up is a situation where, okay, after we evacuate all the objects out, the whole space is empty. It's free to use again, right? So, where's the free list? Well, it's the space itself, right? Allocation into Eden is a pointer bump, right? There's nothing else that we need to do in that particular case. Right, so, we need to look after free list management, fragmentation, possibly compaction, stuff like that. Okay, so here's the actual code from the OpenJDK. that determines which collectors you can actually use. So I've already mentioned some of them, right? So we can either have a serial, or if we use a concurrent mark sweep, which is a partial GC in tenured, we can use that with a par new. The reason why some of these are paired is because, you know, Java Heap is a data structure, and we have to agree upon a common, you know, shape for that particular data structure in order for these algorithms to actually be able to work on it. And these things evolved over time, and of course the shape of Java Heap has been optimized for each of these particular collectors. If we're going to use a parallel GC in old, then we're going to use this old parallel GC for young generational space. And of course, we have this new collector called G1 GC, which I won't focus on so much. Okay, so that's our choices for collection strategies. Okay, so back to our GC log. Let's fit all of this information into what we've just learned. And let's just focus on this particular log record here. So if we look at the colored bits here, what we actually have is, well, the first one is number of seconds since the JVM started. That's when this collection was called for. Now, sometimes you get another time inside the little square brackets there, and that timestamp usually refers to the time when that particular activity started. And sometimes there's a lag between when the GC was called for and when the GC actually gets going. When that happens, then that's when I might want to look at the safe pointing behavior in the application. Maybe there's something preventing the threads to actually get to a safe point. The green bit is the actual stop the world pause time. So one of the things we want to do is we want to pull that green bit out, and we want to add them all up, and then we're going to divide it by the runtime, and that's going to give us our GC throughput number, our GC efficiency, right? Obviously, we want that percentage to be very low. The other bit, the blue bit, says the algorithm we're using. This is using a PS young gen, which means you're using a parallel scavenge, which means we'll be using a parallel old gen collector. Right, so there's a bit of structure here. So like I said, we have these square things that sort of define, try to define where records begin and end. Unfortunately, when you're running a concurrent mark sweep collector with a par new, since both collectors write to the log at the same time and that write is not synchronized, things get funky, shall we say. Okay. So what we have on the outside here is, in these yellow bits, is, this nice record that says what's happening globally in Heap, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at that one and say, okay, our configured size, which is different than our reserve size in this case. So what our configured size is what adaptive sizing is going to tell us that it needs to be to try to maintain high efficiency of collection. Then, you know, if we look at this one here, we're going to see that that's our occupancy before. Then we collect. That's our occupancy after. And then all of this black stuff here, I purposely use white, gray, and black because in garbage collection nomenclature, gray means I don't know if it's dead or alive, white means I know it's alive, and black means I know it's dead. Okay? So in this case, we have occupancy before, occupancy after, and then we have recovered, And if we take the before, after, and subtract them, then that gives us a recovered value, right? And of course, the last value there, as I said before, is the configured size. Okay, hold on, sorry. The slides are on SlideShare. If you don't have to take pictures you want, you can just download them from there. Okay. Now, are we lost in slides? Okay, let's go to the next part, which is this part, that inner record, which describes what's happening in young generational space. So for PS Young Gen, our configured size is 206720K. Our occupancy before is 148069K, right? And our occupancy after the collection is 5859K, so we got a whole pile of objects actually being recovered. But not really being recovered. Some of that recovery might actually be things being promoted into tenured space, right? Basically, that number that's left behind is the residual number that's left in one of the survivor spaces, like Eden will be completely empty. So again, we can do the same thing. Configured minus occupancy, and we can see recovered is 14220, which surprisingly looks like total heap recovered, which means that we've had no promotion into tenured space. Okay? Now, we don't have the values here for what's going on in tenured space, but as you can imagine, what we can do is we can take the total minus young, and then we get whatever's left over is whatever's happened in tenured space, right? So now it's just getting into simple arithmetic, right? So you can see, as we predicted, the promotion is going to be 0K in this particular case. And for survivor spaces, so this is print tenuring distribution. Unfortunately, with PS Younggen, we get some very terse information, but it's still pretty useful, right? Because this is saying that the configured size of the survivor space is that yellow value up there, right? And what we're actually, and in this case, we can actually compare how much was left in young after the collection with the desired survivor space to give us an idea, like is our survivor space too big or too small? There's also another number we can use, which is this thing called tenuring threshold, right? So we have a max of 15 in this case. So when we started up the VM, because I probably set some funky memory settings or something, it automatically says, okay, you seem to know what you're doing, so I'm just going to set the tenuring threshold to 15. If it needs to be something else, you better go and configure it yourself, right? In other words, it's up to you now. If you don't try to configure Heap too much, then it'll default to 4, and that'll be the tenuring threshold, right? So how this works is Hotspot's going to come along, and it's actually going to calculate how, what the expected survivors, number of survivors are from the collection of Eden, and it's going to take that number and it's going to compare it to the size, and if it's bigger, then what we have to do is we have to roll back or recalculate the tenuring threshold. In this case, the tenuring threshold has been recalculated to 3, and this represents a premature promotion event. In other words, I didn't have enough space for all 15 generations of objects. I only have space for 3. So from 4 to 15, off to tenured you go. Okay? That's bad. That puts more pressure in tenured space, which means that either we're going to either run CMS more frequently, or we're going to run full GCs more frequently. So we want to do something to try to stop that from happening, which means that we need to resize our survivor spaces. In contrast, this is a full GC record. So it's basically laid out here with all the sections. It looks very similar to the young generational collection. And in this case, we're reporting on PAR old gen, so that's our parallel collector running in old gen. And it's the same thing. Occupancy before, occupancy after configured size in the brackets, right? And in this case, we're also reporting on perm gen. And again, perm gen is before, after configured size of perm gen. Note that when you do a full GC, young gen completely empties. So that means it goes to size 0, or occupancy of 0, I should say, which means that the full GC also has this extra added bad effect of taking everything that maybe shouldn't be promoted and pushing it up into tenured space. This is what a def new record actually looks like with print tenuring distribution. And as you can see, I got a breakdown of the number of bytes by age. And this is really, really useful, because if I sum these things up over time and create a graph, I can use that information to calculate precisely what the tenuring threshold for this application should be. Yeah? And if you look at it, pretty much everything else is the same. I have before, after, configured size, pause time statistics, right? So I can just parse through these and get whatever field I want out of here, or do the calculation that I need in order to, figure out what's going on. This is a concurrent mark sweep phase. Now, I don't want to go into the intricacies of a concurrent mark sweep. I'll just point out the obvious things, which is the red bits are stop the world phase, so that's your initial mark and your rescan. The white and yellow interleaves are basically pairs of records that indicate when a concurrent phase starts and when it ends, and it gives you an idea of how much CPU time and how much wall clock time it's consumed. Right? There's no sizing information in a CMS record, only pause time information, because the only time you get an idea of size is when you actually do the concurrent reset. Now, intermingled with all of this stuff will be par new collection records. So this is really like condensed, right? Because what's happening is that as the concurrent mark sweep is running, your application is running, it's filling up Eden, and then it's going to promote all of these things up into tenured space. So, you know, as these promotions happen, then the concurrent mark sweep collection actually has to now recalculate or, you know, reset its position based on all of these new objects coming in. Right. So what we want to do is we want to try to use these logs here to try to improve the performance of an application. So I'm going to do this as a case study. So I have this application. I'm going to run it at a whopping 5 transactions per second. It's fast, right? And here's some goals, right? Want to reduce response time, improve transactional throughput, or you know the request retirement rates, and reduce hardware consumption, and you know make sure that we don't have any stalls due to the collection, right? So here's our application. I'm going to run it just with default settings, which means that my heap is going to be configured to 1/64th of all the physical RAM I have on my machine, right? We all knew that, right? Put up your hands if you didn't. Oh, yep, you're the only one, apparently. Or the others are lying. Okay. And likely the default heap is too small, and well, you can see, look, you know, we got a Java laying out a memory error, so, you know, that's a problem. So what does that look like, right? So I'm going to pull those values out. I'm going to dump them in a graph, and I'm going to see, you know, okay, I got blue is partials, red is full, the black line is being heap size, and you can look at all of a sudden it just consume heap. I degrade into frequent full GCs, and basically I'm dead, right? Heap's too small. You can see that in this particular view. This is a Visual VM plugin I wrote. You can get it from java.net. And, okay, so let's put a yellow line on here, right? So that particular collection event, what we can see is in the bottom graph, right? That collection event completely fills the tenured space. So by the time I get to the next time, though, when I get an allocation failure in Eden, I got no room in tenured space. I'm done. Game over. So let's go to run 2. So let's just make the heap bigger. I'm going to estimate I need a gig. And here I have a graph of my response times, because you know my goal is to improve response time. Certainly going from an out-of-memory error to this is a vast improvement in response time, or at least I would hope so. And I'm going to also look at CPU utilization as part of my study of the hardware. So if we look at this particular thing here, that's our primary user transaction here. We can see that, well, okay, my average response time is 145 milliseconds, but my maximum response time is 2.867 seconds. So I got a huge spread here, right? And if I look at CPU utilization, it's like really spiky. Really spiky is generally not good. And it's spiking between 25 and 70%, and probably averaging somewhere around 60% as an eyeball average, right? Not good. Okay. The other thing I want to look at is frequency. Remember I mentioned frequency earlier on? Well, you know, in this case, well, we want to try to decrease the frequency. Frequency means we have to context switch. Context switching is expensive. We don't like systems context switching. So this is effectively garbage collection lock-induced contention, or induced lock contention, I should say. Okay. First, that's our throughput number. So that's the sum of our pause times divided by runtime, 15.56%. We definitely want that below 5%, so that's not very good. That's our GC frequency, the number of collections per second. And that's a fairly reasonable number for this particular app. I think we can do a lot better here. Here's the premature promotion picture. This is the number of times that we had to roll the tenuring threshold back from its max tenuring threshold that we set on the command line, right? 83.3%. That sucks. Okay? We get a bit of breakdown here so we can understand what the curve looks like, right? Here's what it looks like over time. And so this is a graph that's obviously constrained by something, right? Because it's just got a flat top. Normally we're not going to see a flat top in a waveform like this. Yeah, so that this wave's being clipped very badly. And that's an indication, again, that our survivor spaces here are way too small. Right, so let's increase the rate of survivor spaces. Now, we sort of have to do this a little carefully, right? Because, well, if we just increase, so how are we going to do this? Well, we need to increase the size of young generational space overall because, like, if we just increase the size of survivor spaces, we have a zero-sum game, which means that we're going to steal from Eden. If we steal from Eden, we're only going to increase the frequency of collections, not decrease them. Which means our objects are going to age faster, which means they're going to flow through the system faster, which will have probably a devastating effect on our overall throughput. So we don't want to do that. What we actually want to do is we want to give young generational space more space, right, so that we can actually make the survivor spaces bigger without reducing the size of Eden. And in this case, we should maintain the same rate of collections in young generational space. We should have a knock-on effect of decreasing the number of full GCs, if that makes any sense. There's also another problem with the strategy, and the strategy is something called the initiating occupancy fraction. That's about 69% with a concurrent mark sweep collector, plus a safety factor, right? So what that means is when tenured gets to be 69% full, then what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start running the concurrent mark sweep collector. If I steal memory away from tenured, then my live set, right, is going to be actually closer to where that initiating occupancy fraction is. Okay? Now, hopefully I don't get so much promotion, not as much promotion, because I'm catching dead things like in young generational space, but since the top of my live set is closer to the initiating occupancy fraction, I'm certainly going to potentially have a problem there. So it might be advisable just to make Heap slightly bigger overall, right? To take that problem into account. In this case, I'm not going to do it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the new ratio to 1, which means that I got 512 megs for young and 1205 megs for tenured. I don't want tenured to be smaller than young because that could create some other problems. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the survivor ratio to 1. So new ratio is 1, survivor ratio is 1. Oh, in this case, sorry, I'm just fixing the new size to 512. So I'm just going to do a fixed size here. And I'm going to set the survivor ratio to 1, which means that Eden, survivor 0, survivor 1 are all approximately 170 megabytes. Okay? So that was run 1. There's run 2. Here's run 3. Look at that. We went from 145 milliseconds to 81 milliseconds. Moreover, look at our max time, right? Dropped by, well, from 2867 to 1072. So we should all be happy now, right? That's really cool. Moreover, look at our CPU picture. Instead of, basically, we've knocked about 20% off of the average utilization of our CPU by calming the collector down. Moreover, we've completely wiped out premature promotion. Finally, we can see our frequency is down by a factor of 4 or something like that. And our efficiency is now like running around at 3.13%, which is really cool too, right? All we did was change a couple of things on the command line based on some numbers we saw. Okay, next question. Can we improve the memory footprint? Well, here's the new tenuring over time picture, right? So this looks a lot different, yeah? And what it suggests to me is that the survivor spaces only need to be about 60 megabytes in size. Now that might induce some premature promotion, but that's okay. I don't really care. I can tolerate a number of about upwards around 15% premature promotion, and the system seems to cope quite well with that in most cases. This is our tenuring distribution. Remember I said I took the age of bytes, added them all up, and did this? So really what we're seeing here is the tailing edge of the weak generational hypothesis, right? And what it's saying is like, oh man, look at how many objects we're having die between the time we did our 0 collection to the time we did our first collection. And then we get a little bit more at 2, and marginally more at 3. By 4, we're flat, you know? Since I don't have any error bounds on this particular graph, you know, I probably suggest that I want to set the tenuring threshold at 5. And what that's going to do is it's going to say, well, anything after H5 is going to be promoted anyways. So rather than copy it back and forth between the survivor spaces, let's just promote it. Now we're going to reduce our copy costs. Right? So here's run 4, what we're going to do, right? Configure Eden to be 180 megs, right? We've had it set to 170. I'm going to do 180 just to be, just for the maths, right? That's going to maintain our GC frequency overall, hopefully, or at least not make it worse. I'm going to set S0, S1 to 60 megs each. So what I'm going to do is go through this calculation here. I have 180 plus 60 plus 60. That's my N plus 1 plus 1, right? That gives me 300 megs for a young generational space size. I'm going to make tenured the same size, which means my new heap is now 600 megs, so that's a 400 meg savings. Nice, right? And to do that, I'm going to have to set the survivor ratio equal to 3. Yeah? Set the tenuring threshold to 5. Could be 4, but let's just use 5 for safety. And then when I run this, isn't that nice? Look at that. So basically, maybe slightly faster, 74 instead of 81. Our max is still like 1055, so, but our 90th percentile, look at that, 161 to 146. So we have a marginal improvement, a very marginal improvement, but we've done it with much less memory. CPU, unsurprisingly, stays about the same. Frequency, it's about the same. Pause time goal, you know, it's been reduced. So I mean, these are slightly smaller, but you know, nothing to write home about. The big gain is in the is in the memory footprint. Here we're looking at the heap usage after collection, and as you can see, it looks like there's even more possibilities for reductions here, but we don't want to overtune the heap. We definitely want to give it you know, some room for safety in this case, right? So you know, the other, what happened here, right? So GC adapts to a configuration, the configuration we calculated here. So we just need a slightly more heap, so it just grabbed it right there. And look at tenured. We hardly need any tenured now, right? So the performance profile of this application changed very dramatically with just a few settings. And so it's really interesting. So last question I could ask here is like, could the JVM have done this on its own, right? Instead of us having to go through all this mental gymnastics to get here and, you know, looking at all this ugly data and doing these, well, strange calculations. Well, the answer is, yeah, but. If we set the maximum heap size to 1 gig and the new ratio and the survivor ratio to 1, we'll get identical results to what I've just tuned the application to do, right? But only after a warm-up. So in other words, the system has to collect data, and after it's collected that data, it will adapt eventually to the settings you've given it, but only after it's been put after pressure. So what we tend to see is we have a warm-up period where the application is going to put pressure and it's not going to behave well, and then if adaptive sizing works, and I do stress if, because it tends to be a little temperamental, and you do get this, you do get the system to adapt to the configuration it needs to be in, then we'll get identical results. Now, it's just in real life we found this to be very temperamental, so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. One thing we found, which I've talked to the hotspot engineers about, no one has a good explanation about it yet, is that JVMs that lie in low memory tend to adapt better than JVMs that are running in high memory. Anybody have an answer? I'm all ears. So, your results can vary from run to run. That's why I didn't do a demo, is because once I start running all of these other, PowerPoint and everything like that, or Keynote, then I have no idea how the demo is going to work. So, demo was. Great. So, that's 10:42. And that's exactly how I wanted to end this, right? Is because that means that we have, how much time? We have a lot of time for questions, which I really, and I know Heinz was commenting that he really enjoyed the Q&A sessions here at Java 1. So what I'd like to do is just turn it over to you guys to ask questions, and hopefully at least one of us in the room can answer them. Yes, in the back. Martin. Yes. Okay, so that's how the memory pools are actually laid out. So they're contiguous, and they're basically reserved all in one chunk. And then what you're using is actually just allocated out of reserve. So there's this buffer area so that we can, make the spaces bigger. There's a buffer area between young and old so that we don't have to move old. Right? We don't want to move the bottom of old, because when we move the bottom of old, it's like not good. That's going to be a lot of pain. Any other questions? Yes? Do these techniques work for very large heaps? Well, yes. The techniques themselves work. The results might be less than spectacular, given that the heap is large. So, as we all know, as we get into larger and larger heaps, we tend to be dealing with larger and larger live set sizes, and the cost of garbage collection, one of the factors in the cost of garbage collection is the size of the live set, right? The bigger the live set, the longer it takes to scan for roots, the longer it takes to do the copies, the longer it takes to do everything, right? Because we only deal with live objects. We don't deal with dead objects, right? More live objects, more work. Larger heap, more live objects. Yes, sir. Going in the back first, then over here. Yes. Yeah, how to tune the JVM for when you have applications that are behaving differently from each other. Any ideas? It really becomes a problem, I find, is in some cases, if we actually can't find a compromise between the two applications, we would recommend that you don't go the multi-tenancy route. Because if you have to have two completely different GC strategies, there really isn't a good way to manage that in the JVM today. You would actually have to have separate memory spaces, and as I said, the current way to do that is two JVMs. Unfortunately, and we've run into cases like that. We're just saying, okay, if we could split this out, that would be good. I mean, if you look at how some caches are set up, can I mention Oracle products without getting fruit thrown at me, rotten fruit? Coherence, for instance, right, has this idea of near cache. Well, all that is saying I got these long-lived objects that I rarely want to collect. I don't want to mix them with an application that has all these short-lived objects, so I'm going to have to separate them somehow. So I'll just put them in a separate VM, and we'll just do tricks to actually move the data from that VM that's running parallel to me, maybe on the same machine to me, closer. The other thing is that, that particular situation looks like one where G1 seems to be well fitted, right? So as soon as G1 becomes usable, did I say that? No, you might want to consider, testing G1. I mean, there are people actually using G1 now, so it certainly might want to consider it, because the G1 seems like it should ignore data that it doesn't need to collect much better than CMS does, right? And that's really the trick, is like, how do we get these systems to ignore things we don't want them to look at? Cache data seems like something I want to ignore. There was one over here, yes? And then you. Sorry?
Your work performance was still about 1 second, right? What can you do to improve that?
What can you do to improve? Well, I have to understand why I was getting a 1 second response time there. And there might be other effects. When I was actually running these benches, I was playing with the thread pool sizes, right? And when you start playing with thread pool sizes, then the number of variables goes, as to what to do. So really outliers like that, you have to study them specifically to understand what's going on. Yes, you in the blue? I would go to a Java 7 VM, but even so, what you tend to do with latency-sensitive applications is you use a lot of direct buffers and pre-allocate, and then basically use a number of these tricks that just turn the collector off entirely, right? And other people actually try to might size so that they never get a full GC. So we have applications that never have a full GC during their runtime. And that just means that you overtune the young generational collector to try to, just try to make sure things don't escape into tenured space. That can work, but I think mostly what people do is they just use, basically primitives, right? And then allocate buffers for primitives, and then put wrappers around that, and then what happens is that you just end up with a situation where you just never have to, the collector never has to run. Yeah. Yeah, this is the young. Right, and that's why if you pre-allocate buffers for these things, then you can do the allocation directly in the buffers. I mean, it's not the way you're supposed to program in Java, but all of the low latency, high frequency traders do it anyways, right? They're very, very good at not making sure the collector never runs by these, so we say, alternate programming techniques, right? Don't try this at home for the other people. Right. This is not a very satisfactory answer. Sorry. Yes?
So in this case, you ended up with a new size that was about the same as...
Tenured, yes.
Yeah. How does that scale when you get to a large group?
Well, that's why we have G1 and balance and things like that, right? Because it doesn't. The larger that Eden gets, the more that you're looking like now a single space collection, right? And the more it looks like a single space collection, the more you go back to like Java 1.x performance, right? Maybe not quite that bad. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but certainly when you get into, we have deployments on 256 gigs, right? It's just like, even a young gen collection in that size of space is like not desirable, right? So which really means that we need, some of the banks are actually hiring people who know how to write garbage collectors. So just for that particular reason, they're trying to look at alternate. There's also things like what's known as like pauseless collectors that have been implemented by people like Azul, right? So I suppose I should mention them in all honesty, since I just mentioned IBM as well as OpenJDK, right? And they tend to do things quite differently. When they had hardware support for it, they actually put some of the harder things that you had to do. Actually, like if you move an object, right? You have to basically trace all the pointers to it and swizzle all the pointers so that everybody finds the new object. Otherwise, you end up with the same pointer problem you have with C. Azul used to do that as a hardware fault. So you'd make a reference to an object that had moved, it would set a trap in the hardware, and then it would swizzle the pointer for you, like on contact. And there's tricks like that that people actually use to create these like pauseless or more, to put more concurrency into the collectors. I think we're seeing that like in G1 also. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Kind of a basic question, but when I'm looking at the GC log and I've seen analyze both GCs at the time, term J time, and also
Right, okay.
are those cumulative or
No, it's actually a breakout, right? The way you can tell all that is just take all the timestamps and add them up, and if it's greater than the next timestamp in the log, it's like, okay, that can't be right. Yeah. Sometimes simple maths are the best thing to do to help sort things out. The logs I showed you are really clean, and you can get some really ugly ones. Like I just got a new one like 2 days ago that I hadn't seen before. I had to scratch my head for a couple minutes to sort out actually what that log was telling me because they missed a tag, right? So like for instance, concurrent mark sweep does not report on size. This was a concurrent mark sweep that was reporting on size. So obviously it's not a concurrent mark sweep. It's a concurrent mode failure, which I didn't really talk about, right? And a concurrent mode failure is a full GC. So it's like, okay, got it. Not concurrent mark sweep, full GC. But, it took a little sorting to sort that out. Yes, we have one up front here.
How do you resolve memory fragmentation, and what are the best parameters?
Memory fragmentation. Okay, so memory fragmentation is really a big problem with the concurrent mark sweep collector because you don't have compaction, which is the best way to resolve memory fragmentation. Just compact it away. So if anyone doesn't understand this problem, it's like, what happens with your disk when you start deleting files, right? Eventually you end up with, it's a fragment and you go through a defrag, which basically brings everything together again. And that's what a compaction phase is. With a concurrent mark sweep collector, what we've seen is we actually lower the initiating occupancy fraction and give the tenure space bigger because the fragmentation has a tendency to work itself out if it's given enough time. By giving a heap bigger tenured space, right, we're saying, okay, we'll make the heap space bigger, right, so we'll try to give this thing more time. However, I don't want to decrease the frequency of the concurrent mark sweep collector, right, so we have to consider frequency as well as size in this case, right? So I'm going to reduce the initiating occupancy fraction so that it's sitting at the same level that it was prior, right? So if it's at 70% and that means it triggers at 2 gigs, well, I'm going to reduce it to whatever percentage it needs to be in order to sit at a 2 gig trigger threshold, right? And that way I maintain the same frequency of concurrent mark sweep collections, but I'll give it more space overall, which means that I have more time to work through the fragmentation issues, which means I probably won't end up with concurrent mode failure, right? And, and that degrades into full GC. There was one, was it over there? Yeah. I'm not looking over here, so sorry. Yeah?
So can you give us some guidelines on when we should start thinking on increasing the heap size rather than just fine-tuning the size?
Okay, got some guidelines. Okay, rule number 1, out of memory error, increase heap. Rule number 2, too frequent full GCs. That's really a sign that you might want to increase heap, but you also have to consider what's putting pressure on that, right? And those are really the only 2 rules. Is really, when you you're getting into situations where your full GC counts are too high. So I actually do a measure of full GC to GC ratio, and I like to pound that thing down to 0, right? We have one app here, I was looking at it, and the guy's saying, oh, GC is working fine. I said, yeah, your full GC to GC ratio is now sitting at 87%. So I think we can do better in that case, right? In that case, probably a reasonable target is somewhere around 20 to 30%, but even that seems like a fairly high number. Full GC is expensive. The partial GCs are much, much cheaper, so we want to try to get rid of full GCs. In that case, yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, okay. Okay, here's the bad answer to that. You can write a slab allocator that uses direct I/O to do a memory buffer into C Heap and just put them out there. But be careful, because you might end up writing your own garbage collector. The Cassandra guys are well on their way to doing that. Other than that, I'm afraid there's not much you can do. With a concurrent mark sweep collector, if we know that these things are there, we try to get them into Heap, we try to get them compacted, we try to get them in some place where they're like out of trouble, and then just basically adjust initiating occupancy fraction for them. And that's pretty much, unfortunately, all you can do in that case. There isn't a space that says, don't touch this, because every time people have tried to do that, I mean, I did this in a small talk VM. I put in a, never collect this space type space, right? Or have this thing persist after VM's shut down and stuff like that. And, the developers always got it wrong. And you always just blow that memory pool as opposed to, blowing regular heap. So I think there's a lot of resistance to do things like that. But if you can get them outside of the VM when you're not using them, that's probably the best thing to do, like serialize at disk, memcache, something like that, right? Just get them out of the VM when you don't actually need it. If you have a latency concern, then, you're just going to have to take the hit, unfortunately. Any questions from this side of the room? Yes, Ari. Speak up. Stand up. I can't hear you. He's so quiet. So the question is there any statistics that you can get that says an object has been sitting in tenured for a long time? So no, there isn't actually. There's no statistics kept on that. Those are generally kept by profilers, and if you want to profile your production system for that type of general information. Right. Next. It's a good question, though, but unfortunately there just isn't. I mean, the generational counts are kept for in Eden, but by the time they get promoted, then, that's just profiling data. So you have to instrument for that. Sorry? Yeah. Okay, just randomly grab things. Yes, sir. Yes. Implicitly. That was the graphs I showed. Some of the graphs I showed were from Visual VM, and I think they're fairly accurate. Yeah, it's okay. Like if the MBeans are reporting what the collectors are telling them, and the collectors are reporting fairly accurately as far as I've been able to determine, right? In the back, do stand up and come closer if you like. Yeah, and every time they do, I make a lot of noise, so they don't like me anymore. JEP 158. Read it. I just beat on the guy who wrote that specification last night, Tom, because it's, shall we say, butt ugly. Sorry, Stefan, if you can hear that. But that's a new logging framework that's supposed to go into the JDK, into the JVM. And really we're trying to get them to, shall we say, make that better. Once that gets into play, then we should be able to move the GC logs over into that framework, and that hopefully will resolve the concurrency bug. For the moment, what I do is I just outsource the problem to somebody over there. Hey, you're welcome. Okay. JP 157 or 158. It's one of those. I think it's 158. Might be 157. Okay. It's a number. Okay. And we have about 1 minute for about one last question. Anything? Okay. I use our own tool that's written by Jay Clarity called Sensum. That's our tooling company, guys, right? And there's a couple of my colleagues that are back in the corner over there. If you want more information on that, you can talk to them. I think they know more about it than I do. What's that? There's slides that are on SlideShare. Okay, so you can download from there. Okay, I think we're about out of time, so thank you very much for attending, and have a good rest of the day.